Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. In this video, we're going to talk about disability studies. Now, disability studies is a relative newcomer to the field of critical and cultural theory. I'm most familiar with disability theater studies, but basically the concerns of disability studies, kind of like gender study, or kind of like feminism, queer theory, gender studies, critical race studies, things like this. The fundamental question behind disability studies is, how does society define, limit, and realistically oppress people with disabilities, whether that's physical disabilities, intellectual or developmental disabilities, whatever it is, even people with diseases or illnesses. So there's a long history of social stigmatization, and there's some roots to this, actually, ironically, in a branch of New Historicism, because people like Michel Foucault, he wrote a book called Birth of the Clinic, which is about the medicalization of discourse. So the idea of defining health in biopolitical ways, that is, ways that relate to having political power over lives. And this, in a way, helps define some of the early phases of disability studies, because, again, this central question becomes, what does it mean to be disabled in a society that values able bodies? What does it mean to be neurodivergent in a society that values neurotypical mental patterns, etc., etc.? And how does society attempt to marginalize, sideline, silence, and/or erase people with disabilities? Foucault gives us some sense of this in Birth of the Clinic, but he's not specifically concerned with people with disabilities. In the 70s, in the US, you actually had sort of the birth of the disability rights movement that functioned along similar lines to the civil rights movement, to women's liberation, gay liberation, these types of movements. One of the big things that early pioneers in disability studies and in disability liberation focused on was actually the physical architecture of public spaces. So you go to a typical building in the US, a public building in the US, right? Chances are you have a ramp. Why? Well, because of this movement, because one of the things that disability liberation and disability studies people started to do was to say, physical spaces are designed for people without disabilities. And actually, that's bad for everybody. That's actually one of the really cool things about this. Like, people in wheelchairs can't go upstairs. If the only way to get into, say, a public library or a courthouse or a bank is to go upstairs, even if it's just a small number of stairs, then the physical architecture of that building has excluded certain people from entering that public space. And so this is the kind of thing that disability studies is interested in, is how does society function in ways that marginalize people with disabilities? And interestingly enough, with an example like the ramps that are now required to be put on public buildings for accessibility, this actually doesn't just benefit people with disabilities. This benefits actually a wide range of people. So elderly people who may find it easier to go up a ramp than upstairs. Mothers or fathers or parents of any kind who have a baby in a stroller. If you have a lot of, say, papers or something like that, and some people will put, if you're, like, I know a number of teachers who do this. You collect up final papers or something like this, and people will bring rolly suitcases because it's just easier than carrying. I mean, some semesters I teach 96 students. It's difficult to carry 96 papers if you're collecting them all in person. And so some people bring rolly suitcases or something like this, and that's a lot easier to get up a ramp than it is upstairs. The same thing, you think about crosswalks in the US. There's a little dip in the sidewalk, right? You've got the sidewalk, normally curb is a couple inch and a half, 2 inches, whatever it is, above the road. But you come to a crosswalk, there's a dip. Why? Because this is easier for people in wheelchairs, easier for people with walkers, easier for people with disabilities. But again, if you've got a shopping cart full of groceries, it's much easier to do that. If you've got a stroller, whatever it is. So this is one of the things that's really, really cool about disability studies and disability activism, actually, is that a lot of the things that are implemented to increase accessibility have social benefits for everybody, or for a lot of people beyond just the disabled. Now, one of the big ongoing issues in disability studies is the role of the artist with disabilities. And in some ways, this is, I think, a similar concern to things LGBT artists, female artists, artists of color, indigenous artists, etc., etc. Like, is it how much can or should artists with disabilities produce art that's not about the experience of being disabled? And Christy Johnston, who's a Canadian theorist of disability theater, makes a distinction between disability theater and theater by artists with disabilities. So theater by artists with disabilities is just theater that happens to have been created by artists with disabilities or performed by artists with disabilities, whatever it is. It's not necessarily about the experience of having a disability. That's not the focus necessarily. It's a way of demonstrating that people with disabilities can be equal participants in the creation of art, or the creation of theater in Johnston's case. So that's one sort of branch, one sort of concern is, how do performance companies, how do art installations, museums, galleries, whatever it is, how do they ensure that their spaces are accessible and constructed in such a way that people with disabilities can be equal participants? So again, I'll give you an example. Physical architecture. When I was an undergrad, I was part of a group at Shepherd University called the Rude Mechanicals. Still around. They're still doing shows. Basically, it was undergrads who performed Shakespeare in the fall, medieval plays in the spring semester, and now they do Greek plays during the summer. The stage that we performed on had 2 sets of stairs going up the wings, up to the wings, 1 set of stairs going up the center of the stage. There was a set of stairs coming up the back from outside. It was not really a stage that was particularly accessible if we had had an actor, say, in a wheelchair, or an actor who had some sort of difficulty navigating stairs. So that's one of the things that that this one strand of disability studies is pushing for, is about creating artistic spaces, theatrical spaces, whatever it is, in which people with disabilities have equal access and can therefore be engaged in this artistic production. The other side in Johnston's schema is disability theater. And this is specifically theater that is focused on the experience of being disabled. Again, whether that's intellectual, cognitive, or developmental disabilities, physical disabilities, whatever it is. So this tends to be a bit more didactic often. It tends to be very focused on the direct questions of disability studies. What does it mean to be disabled? How do disabled people navigate the world? How does society attempt to limit the potential, limit the engagement of people with disabilities, etc., etc.? These types of plays, this type of art, again, tend to be much more directly concerned with with making a specific point. So again, there's a lot of feminist drama, there's a lot of post-colonial drama, there's a lot of critical race drama, there's a lot of LGBT drama, etc., that takes this kind of approach that very directly says, here is what I want the audience to get from this. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because, again, along the same lines as queer theory and critical race studies, etc., one of the big pushes with disability studies is to increase the visibility of people with disabilities, and specifically to increase the visibility in such a way that makes clear that people with disabilities, provided there are reasonable accommodations, can be active and full members of society. Along similar lines, this is actually another issue that does come up in disability studies, is particularly with movies and TV representations of people with disabilities, the ethics of casting non-disabled actors to play characters with disabilities. There are significant disagreements about the ethics of this. Whether or not it is, for instance, ethical to cast an actor who does not have autism to play a character with autism, or to cast a sighted actor to play a blind character or something like this, as opposed to finding an actor with autism, a blind actor, whatever it is. part of the difficulty with this is that because traditionally people with disabilities have not been accepted to actor training programs, have not been cast in movies, TV shows, commercials, plays, etc., etc., there often aren't necessarily that many actors with disabilities available simply because there has not been a history of opportunity. And so this is kind of where the gray area comes in with the debate about whether or not casting non-disabled actors for roles with disabilities is an ethical problem. Because there are those who argue that by having characters who are disabled, whether or not the actors playing them are, this will increase the visibility and hopefully start to show that people with disabilities can be engaged, can be artists, can be actors, can be full members of society. And so the argument is that can open up new opportunities for people with disabilities so that in the future we won't need to cast non-disabled actors into roles for characters with disabilities. But again, it's kind of a gray area because that casting non-disabled actors, even if that ends up long-term increasing the visibility of people with disabilities, it is still giving work to an actor without disabilities rather than finding an actor with disabilities. So these are the kinds of concerns that disability studies are interested in, is how do we understand the structures of inequality and the limitations placed upon people with disability? How do we resist them? And how do we create a more equitable society?